Since Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, Western observers have struggled to understand why the majority of the population seems to side with the regime. Western-based discussions of the Russian information space and public attitudes tend towards unhelpful binaries of support or don't support, while Russian public opinion is, in fact, much more divided and nuanced than this binary implies. In this video, we analyze Russian society through several observable outputs to understand how different constituencies react to the war and to show the need for a nuanced perception of Russian public opinion. Conducting surveys in times of war is by definition challenging. We can legitimately ask ourselves how to interpret survey results, especially the extensive non-response bias. That is, the high number of people who refuse to participate or answer don't know or can't answer to some questions. Yet, despite this major caveat, several poll agencies, such as the independent Levada Center, Russian Field, and Chronicles, as well as cultural anthropologists and ethnologists, have explored the Russian population's reaction to war. They emphasize the diversity of views, as well as citizens' struggles to cope with interpreting the war and expressing their own mixed feelings.
Can we trust public opinion surveys in Russia during wartime? The answer is yes, but like all surveys, they need to be interpreted carefully. There are three primary problems. First, it might be that Russians are simply less likely to take part in surveys after the war began. The Levada Center has been conducting surveys in Russia for years, and they report that the respondents that they contact are just as likely to take part in surveys today as they were prior to the war. Researchers conducting online surveys find the same thing, so it doesn't appear that response rates have fallen dramatically once the war began. Second, it could be that respondents are less willing to answer potentially sensitive questions, that they're more likely to say that they don't know or refuse to answer these kinds of questions. I've conducted some research on this with 3 colleagues, and we do find some support for this. When we asked respondents a simple yes or no question about whether or not they supported President Putin prior to the war, about 7% of respondents said that they don't know or refuse to answer. When we asked the same question after the war, 13% said that they don't know or refuse to answer. It could be that after the war, respondents are less willing to say that they did not support President Putin. Or it could be that the answers reflect greater uncertainty induced by the war, and that these answers are actually capturing how respondents feel. It's hard to tell. However, when we asked respondents to rate their support for President Putin on a scale from 1 to 10, only 3% of respondents said that they don't know or refuse to answer. So when given this more nuanced question, respondents do seem to be willing to answer even a potentially sensitive question like this. Now, it could be that Russians are simply lying when they're answering sensitive questions, and researchers have a number of sophisticated techniques in order to elicit honest responses, and they find that about 5 to 10% of Russians are unwilling to express their true beliefs when asked about the war. We can also learn a lot by looking at direct answers to sensitive questions. For example, in our survey conducted in the fall of 2023, we found that 75% of Russians were willing to say that they did not support a general mobilization in order to boost the war effort. In addition, even among Putin supporters, just 54% said that they supported continuing the war. These responses give us some confidence that respondents are not simply parroting the government line or telling interviewers what they want to hear. Now, even in the best of times, surveys are a blunt tool. They don't capture nuance well, and the answers are often very sensitive to question wording. And it's important to use other measures to study public opinion as well. However, when interpreted carefully, we can still learn a great deal about Russian politics using surveys today.
A majority of Russian citizens, from 50 to 70% depending on the survey and how the question is framed, support the so-called special military operation.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Support has been the dominant, even overwhelming, attitude towards the powers that be for about 2 decades, practically since Putin came to power. This means that this large majority's acceptance of the war may well reflect support for the president and his policies generally, rather than support for the war per se. But for this majority of supportive Russian citizens, there is no uniform reading of the war. Some adherents of this group are knowingly and actively supporting the special military operation. Active support means not only believing in the legitimacy of the operation, but also, for instance, participating in grassroots initiatives to fundraise for soldiers and accepting the potential for new mobilization or further sacrifice for the war. In some cases, this group supports the war, but disagrees with what they see as the regime's weak handling of it.
У нас нехватка боеприпасов 70%! Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?
These jingoistic warmongers believe the Russian government is wrong to refrain from mass mobilization and needs to be more decisive on the battlefield. Such opinions abound on military bloggers' Telegram channels, which have become popular in Russia with several hundreds of thousands of followers, and were embodied by the infamous Wagner private military company and its leader Yevgeny Prigozhin before his attempted coup in June 2023. Others offer what we can call ritual support for the special military operation. They reproduce official language, but wouldn't engage in active support such as volunteering. Many think the government makes the best decision, and therefore would simultaneously support further offensive actions in the war and peace negotiations, whichever the state pursues. A third group shows total apathy towards anything political, has formed no opinion on the war, and supports it as long as they can withdraw into private life. For this majority of acquiescing Russian citizens, there is no uniform reading of the war. Some approve of the narrative of resistance against the collective West, but regret the violence and the destruction of Ukraine. Some care about human suffering, but do not see themselves as responsible in any aspect. Some consider that even if they have reservations toward the conflict, they should support their country, right or wrong, in these difficult times where the nation is seen as under threat. At the other end of the spectrum, surveys also reveal that up to 20% of Russians answer no to the question of whether they support the special military operation. A significant group considering the heavy propaganda and potential imprisonment for anti-war remarks. This part of the population tends to live in an inner exile at home, refraining from speaking publicly about their feelings for fear not only of repression, but also of social stigmatization by friends and family. Some Russians have decided to leave. The escalation of repression and the risk of mobilization pushed hundreds of thousands to flee to other countries, mainly settling temporarily in nearby Georgia, Armenia, Latvia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. A year and a half after the war began, estimates of the number of émigrés ranged from a conservative 500,000 to a probably inflated 2 million. Many of those who left shortly after the invasion, in March and April 2022, were opposing the war. Those who left in September and October were mostly fleeing mobilization. Among those émigrés, a minority tries to be politically active against the war, but the majority focuses on simply coping with the difficulties of building a new life in a new place.
По делу называют предателями, если уехали, и родину не поддержали.
Those who stayed in Russia often see these émigrés as traitors, or at least as egotistic and unpatriotic citizens who were not ready to assist their country at a moment of deep crisis. A very small minority has decided to resist at home. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, nearly 20,000 people have been arrested for protesting, and more than 8,000 people have been fined for discrediting Russian forces, mostly due to social media activities. Almost 700 anti-war protests have been recorded, a large majority of which were organized in March 2022. After that, because of new repressive laws, the number of anti-war protests declined dramatically. From September to October 2022, several protests happened in ethnic republics such as Dagestan, Buryatia, and Saha-Yakutia, where, in the first months of the war, the number of draftees, and therefore of dead and wounded, was statistically higher than in many other Russian regions. These protests were not against the war itself, but rather against poor material and logistical conditions associated with mobilization, and were not repressed as violently as the more political demonstrations. There have also been many symbolic acts of resistance, such as painting anti-war graffiti or writing private anti-war messages on social media networks. A violent resistance seems to have emerged too, though it is difficult to know exactly who is behind it. There have been several cases of railway sabotage targeting military transport routes, and arson targeting fuel warehouses and military enlistment offices. However, it is challenging to identify whether these acts were organized by local resistance groups, Ukrainian intelligence services, or a collaboration between the two. As this brief analysis shows, Russian society is divided in its vision of and support for the war. There are not two camps, for and against, but rather myriad intermediary positions with mixed feelings and difficulties for citizens to formulate a position. These different opinions often intersect with other divisions, such as age, social class, ethnicity, education, etc. It remains difficult to forecast how public opinion may evolve. A series of military defeats may weaken belief in the regime's capability and force citizens to feel more engaged. It can push the needle towards warmongers who call for full-scale mobilization, or it can spread the idea that Russia itself is in existential danger, and therefore generate more support for the war in the hope of a victory. The regime's ability to sustain the largely shared feeling that the war is a foreign policy problem separate from everyday life will be a key factor in the stability of public opinion.